Great. Now, starting with the shooting of one fateful photograph of a diner on November 29th, 1980, Larry Cultrera has logged thousands of miles and shot thousands of diner photographs in the last 41 plus years. In October of 2007, he started writing the Diner Hotline Weblog, which is a continuation of a column he penned for the SCA's journal for over 18 years previously. He's been researching diners and their history since 1980, although he can trace his interest back to his childhood in Medford, Massachusetts. Larry has been featured on various TV shows that covered the subject of diners, as well as in many newspaper and magazine articles over the years. Larry's Zoom presentation is entitled From Lunch Carts to Mega Restaurants, The Evolution of the American Diner, and will cover the various styles and designs that diners have had through history. And I might say we're having a slight technical difficulty in that we can't get a picture of Larry's camera's not working, so we're not going to see him tonight, but we can hear him and we can see his presentation. So without further ado, Larry, will you please unmute yourself and go ahead?
Thank you, Brian. As you said to everybody, this is a slide presentation. I've done various versions of this over the year, but this is the first time you're going to see this one the way it actually sits. This features all of my scanned images of the photos and slides I've taken over the years. And I'm pretty happy with the way things look. So without further ado, this is, let's do this. From lunch carts to mega restaurants. The Evolution of Diners by Larry Cultrera. Diners, as Brian mentioned, have been part of my life for almost as long as I can remember. I did start photographing them. Hold on. That's not supposed to. I started photographing them in 1980, and I'll tell you a little bit about that right now. Diners that I remember going to as a child, Carol's Colonial Dining Car in Medford, Massachusetts, which was brought in around 1961 to replace an earlier diner. Also, the Starlight Diner, which was also in Medford. That's the one I asked my dad about when I was around 5 or 6 years old. I asked him if it was a railroad car, and he said, no, it's a building that was built in a factory to look like a railroad car, but it's not a railroad car. So Bobby's Diner also was on the same street as the Starlight, but closer to Medford Square and within a couple of blocks of Carol's. Victoria Diner was another one I went to starting in 1965, and that's in Boston. Around 1979, April of 1979, I purchased a brand new Chevy van that allowed me to increase the scope of my sort of road trips without having to worry about the vehicle breakdown or anything like that. And summer of 1980, I purchased a pre-owned Mamiya 35 millimeters SLR camera with in the back of my mind, I thought I would start taking photos of the diners that I had just started going and visiting quite a bit at that point in time. Also, October of 1980, I purchased the book Diners of the Northeast by Donald Kaplan and Alan Belling, which really sort of fueled the thing and led to me taking my very first diner photograph in November of 1980 of the Bypass Diner in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Shortly thereafter, I purchased American Diner by Richard J.S. Gutman and Elliot Kaufman, which was at that time the most comprehensive history of diners at that point. And the next month, I purchased the book Diners by John Bader. That really fueled the way I sort of showed me the direction and how I was going to start really photographing the diners. It gave me a lot to go on. Those 3 books I credit with, just getting me into that type of frame of mind. And I bought them in exact reverse order because John Bader's book came out first, Richard Gutman's came out second, and then Diners of the Northeast came out third. So, but anyways, led to me taking bunches of pictures. This was one of my first time exposures, the Olympia Diner. And this shows a lot of different diners and how they looked over the years. Then I start with the early history of diners, 1872 to 1920. This is a photo from a Rich J.S. Gutman collection. You'll see that in the bottom of some of these. This was Providence, Rhode Island, 1872. Walter Scott introduced the first night lunch wagon, a converted freight wagon with windows cut into the sides. Due to the fact that most restaurants closed after 8 p.m., Scott saw a ready-made clientele of night shift workers and other people out and about in the late evening and into the overnight hours. He handed out previously prepared sandwiches, pie, and coffee to those late night customers who thronged to his wagon. Within a short time, Scott developed a fleet of these night lunches, and other businessmen saw the success that Scott was having and opened their own wagons. A standout among Scott's emulators was Reuel B. Jones, a Providence police patrolman who also became very successful running a fleet of 7 wagons. Worcester, Massachusetts, 1884. Samuel Messer Jones, a cousin of Reuel B. Jones, moved to Worcester from Providence and introduced the first lunch wagon to this city. Sam Jones became successful enough to afford to have a new wagon built in 1887, which was large enough to house a small kitchen and also to accommodate a handful of customers. These customers were, for the first time, able to come inside to order and eat their food. This feature was especially welcome on nights when the weather was inclement. In 1889, Jones sold all but one of his fleet of wagons to Charles H. Palmer. In 1891, in Worcester, Charles Palmer received the first patent given for a lunch wagon design. This patent described what was to become the standard configuration for the next 15 to 20 years. This is one of the ads for Charles Palmer's lunch wagons. Also in Worcester, Massachusetts, 1892, Thomas H. Buckley started the New England Lunch Wagon Company, which later evolved into the T.H. Buckley Lunch Wagon and Catering Company. This company not only built lunch wagons, but also sold equipment to be used in them. Buckley was described as the first lunch wagon king and was credited with setting up wagons in some 275 towns across the country. He was the originator of the White House cafes, the most upscale and famous of the mass-produced lunch wagons of the late 1890s. Worcester, Massachusetts, again, 1905. Wilfred H. Barriere, a carpenter who formerly worked for Buckley, went into business with blacksmith Stearns A. Haynes to form a new company constructing lunch wagons. This actually was taken over fairly shortly after that by Philip H. Dupre and renamed the Worcester Lunch Car and Carriage Manufacturing Company in 1906. That's Mr. Barriere standing in front of what was probably to become the very first Worcester lunch car. Worcester lunch car number 200. They started at 200. New Rochelle, that's a tag that Worcester used to actually, they actually identified wiring within the diner up by the fuse box, so they know where everything had to be connected. New Rochelle, New York in 1905, Patrick J. Tierney began manufacturing lunch wagons and is credited with introducing many improvements to the lunch cart during his tenure of 1905 to 1917. Let's see, Jerry O'Mahony in Bayonne, New Jersey, 1913, began manufacturing lunch carts with partner John J. Hemp. O'Mahony was destined to become the leading manufacturer of lunch wagons and diners for decades. The previously mentioned manufacturers were the early pioneers in this industry, and many companies to come after them. Many of these newer concerns were started from former employees of Tierney and O'Mahony, including most notably DeRaffaelli, Coleman, and Federo. Held in New Jersey, 1941, Paramount Diners patented the split construction method that became widely used by most companies thereafter. This enabled the manufacturers to build diners in multiple sections for transportation to operating location. This method of modular construction continues to this day, with a handful of companies still building what most people call diners. So here's an early lunch wagon, Woburn, Massachusetts, being brought to its site downtown. It was Oni Doherty's lunch wagon. This was, I believe, in the 1930s, possibly even the 40s. I can't tell exactly, but there are some cars that look like 1940 vintage in the background. Here's a lunch wagon in Northampton, Massachusetts on a snowy winter night. And then again, here's one on Old Orchard Beach in Maine, right on the beach. Here's a Palace Nut Lunch. By a certain point in time after the turn of the century, some of these wagons were starting to not be mobile, and they would the owners would place either something to block the wheels up to make them look a little bit more permanent, like this one here. Here's one again set up next to the Broadway Theater in Derry, New Hampshire. This is one of the only really old remaining lunch wagons at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, the Owl Night Lunch. Richard Gutman had a hand in the restoration of this piece of history. Here's one of the later Worcester lunch cars that actually was pulled by a truck. It's now stationary and the truck is missing, and there's a building attached to it, but that's Gilly's Night Lunch in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Hickey's was another mobile lunch wagon built around 1948, or was it 46? I don't know. Anyways, late 40s after the war. It was one of the last ones built and put on a truck. Haven Brothers actually goes back to the old horse-drawn lunch wagon days, but this was a truck that was made especially for them that they still use today in Providence, Rhode Island, the birthplace of lunch wagons. Other vehicles and whatnot were used over the years. Here's an old converted bus, Mary's Diner in Georgetown, Connecticut. Martin Diner in Martin, Michigan was an old trolley car converted into a diner. Also, one of those interurban trolleys out in Ohio. This was, I believe, I can't remember the name of the town off the top of my head, but this was also in Ohio, a very large car. And closer to where I live in South Middleborough, Massachusetts, was Sisson's Diner, another trolley car that was converted. You can still see the headlight here and the bumper, so that was kind of interesting. Railroad cars were also used on occasion, like Leona Hillier's Dinette in Galesburg, Ohio, Illinois. And also the club car on Nantucket was an old railroad car. Now you can see diner manufacturers were actually borrowing from the railroad imagery, like the Worcester Lunch Car Company here. Here's an actual railroad dining car. So, you can see they both had the monitor roof and the long row of windows. This is the interior of a similar car, probably the same one, with a lot of woodwork. They just had booths, no counter service, of course, on the trains. These next batch of slides came by Richard Gutman from the Tierney Company, showing the process of building diners in the 1920s and so on. Here you can see a couple of diners out in the rear of this photo in partial stages of completion. In the foreground, the beginning of another one, just the platform on wheels. Here we see the framing up on the inside of one. And here you can see the ceiling has been put in place and the beginnings of the counter and back bar are being installed. Here we see the interior has been fairly finished with the ceiling all varnished, tile work on the walls, the floor, and the counter, as well as marble countertop there, and the back bar cabinetry is in place, as well as the hood over the cooking area. Here we have putting the last varnish coat on the ceiling. The stools are in place minus the stool tops at this point. And you can see that this one was narrow. It had no booths. So it had 2 shelves by the front windows along with stools. So it increased the amount of people that could sit there. And the back bar is in place, the coffee urns, the steam table, the bun warmer, all that is in place. And here we have, they were actually hand lettering these at the time. This was probably before porcelain enamel was widely used. And once the diner was completed, they were transported over the road, sometimes by truck like this Worcester lunch car. This was around 1950, Ann's Diner in Salisbury being delivered to its site. O'Mahony Diner being delivered by train car. It was actually, the wheels were removed and it was attached to a flatbed train car, and they moved it to a site that way, at least to a point where they could remove it and then put the wheels back on and move it to its location. Here's an O'Mahony being put on a barge to go across a body of water. Diners in the 1920s started getting, well, they were still small at that time. This was a Worcester lunch car from 1925. Interior, you can see again, just counter and stools. This was about the smallest you would see at this point. Towards the end of the 20s, they actually started getting a little bit longer and wider. This one had the shelf on the inside, like the earlier pictures of the Tierney. Here's one, a nice 1920s vintage O'Mahony that was restored in the last 20 years. Dan's Diner up in Spencertown, New York. This guy took 10 years to make this diner look the way it did, and it's beautiful. I hear it's for sale now, as a matter of fact. Diners in the 1930s started getting bigger, longer, and wider. As you can see now, these have booths in it and counter and stools. This was quite a long one from the Worcester Lunch Car Company. Towards the end of the 30s, they started getting a little streamlined with rounded corners like this O'Mahony. And Silk City Diners were building some unique models at this point. This was one of a handful that I've seen of this style. This is in near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And the diners of the 1940s started having stainless steel used as decoration, usually around the windows and such. This one still had the porcelain enamel and such. Another one with stainless steel and porcelain with a bit more stainless steel, actually. And the interiors started featuring Formica for the ceilings and a lot more stainless steel on the back bar instead of tile. This one actually has tile on the apron and on the floor, the apron of the counter and on the floor. And also they introduced some more streamlining, like the Sterling diners. This was a Sterling streamliner, the first diner to actually be on the National Register of Historic Places in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. It's the interior of a streamliner. This was the Salem diner, which is now closed in Salem, Massachusetts. Diners in the 1950s featured a ton of stainless steel by then. They got a lot more bigger, as you can see. Almost entirely, I think the tile work is pretty much gone here. You see terrazzo floors starting to make inroads, and the bases of the counter, and even some of the booths, the benches for the booths had, some of them had actual terrazzo bases too. But this one had indirect lighting, which showed up probably around 1950. You started seeing more and more of indirect lighting. This was the last Worcester lunch car built in 1957, I believe. And unfortunately, around this period of time, fast food restaurants like McDonald's and Burger King started to make inroads into the clientele that had been primarily diner related, and started hurting the business. And O'Mahony went out of business at this point. The Mountain View Diner Company built their last diner, and the Worcester Lunch Car Company built their last diner. So the market was shrinking a bit. Diners of the 1960s saw a switch over from the railroad imagery to more of a Googie style California coffee shop. This was a model by DeRaffaelli Diners out of New Rochelle with the folded plate or zigzag roof. Unfortunately, this diner, which is actually still around, has been completely covered and doesn't look like this anymore. Also this was Whately, Massachusetts. The filling station was a model by the Cullman Diner Company with the flared out body and large windows, and it was very nice. This one here was actually a 1950s stainless steel diner. They got redone on site with this unbelievable facade. This was down near Pendle, Pennsylvania. Then you started seeing more of the colonial thing happening, the design work. This has got some the permastone brick on the facade, large windows, probably wagon wheel lamps on the inside like this. This one actually has the oxbow lamps with some fieldstone on the back wall, all terrazzo and formica and drop ceiling. This one shows a 60s style with the beams and such, wagon wheel lamps. A lot of paneling. They really started changing at this point. Then diners of the 1970s went further with they went with a lot of brick, and mansard roofs started appearing. And here's another one with stonework and brick on the outside, and a sort of railing to help hide the air conditioning and heating HVAC equipment. There's another one from that period with mansard and brick. And the Mediterranean styling came into play by the 1970s too, with the arched windows and the sort of Spanish tile mansard. Then the diners of the 1980s started going to a sort of, I like to call it high-tech look, where there was a lot of mirror finished stainless steel just started being used by companies like Cullman and DeRaffaelli. And also they really started looking different at this point. The railroad imagery was definitely gone, except for by the end of the 80s, people started looking backwards, and they had diner companies like Cullman Industries build them a sort of a reasonable facsimile of an older style diner like this one in Chevy Chase, Maryland. right on the edge of DC, the American City Diner, and also the original Silver Diner, which is a chain of diners in the DC, Virginia, and I think they're even into Pennsylvania. I'm not sure at this point. But they have a huge, this one here is now gone, but this was the first one. And diners from the 1990s to now. See all the mirror finished stainless steel, the glass block is there. It's sort of a retro styling, and all the companies offered something like this. Here's a Coleman diner that was redone on site to look very modern. It looked a lot different before this one. This was also redone on site by DeRaffaelli, the Mill Plain Diner in Connecticut. This was a 1990s vintage DeRaffaelli that had some unique look to it. Now, diner manufacturers, there were many of them over the years. I'm going to go through a few of them. Worcester Lunch Car and Carriage Company. This was one of the late model diners that actually featured a clock that said Worcester Diners. They built a lot of monitor roof diners like this one, and barrel roof diners like this one with the porcelain enamel. This was one of the later model Worcesters from the 1950s. It had the rounded corners similar to what the New Jersey diners were doing. That Worcester only built a handful of these. And this particular one, in more recent times, had that addition put on the right-hand side. They matched the stainless steel work and the enamel to make it look like it was part of the original diner. Patrick J. Tierney Company built all barrel roof diners. This was in Salem, Massachusetts. It disappeared in the early 80s. I heard it had the wheels under it still. And this was one that was in Pennsylvania that eventually moved to another Tonawanda, I think, Pennsylvania, and it's now for sale, as I recall. Jerry O'Mahony Diners built a lot of diners, probably the most amount of diners of one company, I would think. This was one from 1938, the Summit Diner in Summit, New Jersey. This was one of their later models from the mid-50s, Wolf's Diner in Dillsburg, Pennsylvania. And then after O'Mahony folded, some of the people who worked for O'Mahony started a short-lived company called Mahoney Diners. And this was the only one that known to exist at this point. This was the Royal Diner in Kingston, New York, which later was moved up to Springfield, Vermont, and is now the Springfield Royal Diner. Cullman Dining Car Company, also known as Cullman Industries, built diners from the 30s on, well, probably late 20s, I think. This was a beauty from the early 40s. This was their old plant in Avenel, New Jersey. That's my old Chevy van parked out in front. If you look through that door that's open, the big door, you can see a diner being built out and back. By this time, they were all steel construction with sheet steel being the primary sub material before they put the exterior on. And here's a Cullman Diner being installed in Danbury, Connecticut in the early 80s. You can see the different sections that were brought in, and all those seams would be covered with the, more of that stone. So you would never know that it was brought in that many sections. But Cullman also built other things, including these buildings for Middlesex Community College in Bedford, Massachusetts. These are all modular constructed, and they were brought in the late 1990s. They brought this up there. DeRaffaelli Manufacturing, still around, still building diners. This was one of theirs from around 1950. This was that first diner I photographed, the Bypass Diner. This was one of their later diners from probably the late 80s, early 90s. Here's a diner being constructed in the yard at the Raffley. And as you can see, they're using real stone here to build that. Swingle Diners was around until 1988, 87, 88. They built a couple of diners that I used to go to, the Victoria in Boston and Carol's Diner in Medford. There's Carol's and there's a Victoria. So PMC Diners, also known as Paramount Modular Concepts, was the evolution from Paramount Dining Car Company. This was a diner being constructed inside their plant. And they had a large yard behind the plant that they took in old diners and trade, and then they would completely rehab them and make them larger to resell. This was an early Paramount diner from the 40s. And Fodero Dining Car Company was around until 1971. This was a beautiful one from the Ingleside Diner in Pennsylvania. This was a later version, probably 1970s, the Crossroad Diner in Mount Holly, New Jersey. And Mountain View Diners built a lot of mostly stainless steel diners. J.B. Judkins made Sterling Diners. This was the Sterling Streamliner. They also made smaller versions called the Sterling Dinette, like this one. This was in Ohio. And larger non-streamlined diners like the Wellsboro in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania. Pollard Company was out of Lowell, Massachusetts. They built a handful of diners. Not sure exactly how many they built. This one is up in Biddeford, Maine, and still operating. And the only other one known right now is the Bristol Diner in Bristol, New Hampshire. Capitol Diner in Lynn, Massachusetts was built by the Brill, J.G. Brill Company, their dining car division. And another one that was still around until, the last 20 years was the Miss Troy Diner in Troy, New York. That one had been modified, but the interior was still fairly intact. Ward and Dixon out of the Erie, Lake Erie region of New York State built a bunch of diners. This one here is the Miss Port Henry Diner in New York. Also out right in actually the same town that Ward and Dickinson built diners was this diner, Steve's, which has been restored since I took these photos. I don't have photos of it that way. Bixler Manufacturing Company built sectional diners that they usually built them, knocked down, and put them together on site. This was in Syracuse, New York. Another Bixler was out in near Albany, New York. And Rochester Grills were very similar to Bixler's, almost identical in a lot of ways. This was also Syracuse. And then the Patterson Vehicle Company built Silk City Diners. This is Proud's Diner in Sussex, New Jersey, and the Manasquan Diner in Manasquan, New Jersey. Master Diners built a bunch of diners that were, some were with different various styles. This was in New Hampshire, the Bendix in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey. And Bramson Engineering only built 2 diners. This was the only one that still exists in Connecticut. And Comac Diners built a few diners over the years. Jack's Diner in Albany is one, and the Tasty Diner in Laurel, Maryland is another. Valentine Manufacturing was one of the only non-East Coast diner builders. This was out of Wichita, Kansas. I found this diner in Waverly, New York. It had been altered on the outside, but it was obvious what it was, and it was still operating as a diner at this point. And I was intrigued to find out in my hometown of Medford, Massachusetts, we had at least 2 Ballantyne Diners. This was in Medford Square. It disappeared by 1960. It was an early chain that this guy Howard Russ started, and he featured radar ranges, which actually didn't last long. And the chain broke up, and this one became the Humpty Dumpty Diner, and another one in near Tufts University became the Jumbo Diner or something like that. Starlight Diners out of Florida and Georgia area built a lot of Denny's diners in the 1990s, like this one in Rhode Island. And this one here in Middleborough, Massachusetts, Dave's Diner. Dynamite Diner is very similar. These are definitely out of Georgia. Very similar to Starlight's, but a little bit more plain. A lot of mirror finish, but this one was in Massachusetts as well. And I have a section on repurposed diners because that's always intrigued me. Here we have a stainless steel DeRafferty diner made into a Chinese restaurant. Another diner in upstate New York that became an antique shop, Sunburst Antiques. Here's a former Worcester lunch car that became a tire warehouse, tire store. And here's an old barrel roof diner from the 20s that became an office for an oil company in Wakefield, Rhode Island. And here's a barber shop that used to be in Oxford, Massachusetts. The Iron Horse Cafe in Willimantic, Connecticut. A record store in Brunswick, New Jersey. And the Balloon Boutique in Lynn, Massachusetts. Also a package store in Marlborough, Massachusetts. And here's the ultimate diner as part of somebody's house. Abandoned diners have always intrigued me as well. Here's one that was found in the backyard of somebody's house in Mansfield, Massachusetts. Off the side of a road in New Hampshire, a former streamliner known as the Rainbow Vets Diner out of Manchester. This was in Hooksett. Here's a diner out in Pennsylvania. I can't remember the town off the top of my head, but this actually had operated someplace else and it was moved here, but it was never completed, and therefore it just stayed like that for years. And here's another one that was moved out of Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and it was on somebody's farm not far away. But what spurred me into photographing abandoned diners was the 1973 album cover LP by Daryl Hall and John Oates, The Abandoned Luncheonette. Well, we did a blog post about this in 2010, which probably became the most widely viewed blog post we did on Diner Hotline. And I actually co-wrote this with a friend of mine from Michigan who did a lot of work on the background information. That diner on the cover was the former Rosedale Diner of Pottstown, Pennsylvania. This was a postcard from when it was operating at its old location. It came from Fodero Diners minus an entryway. Apparently, when the person who bought it didn't want to pay for an entryway at that time. So once he probably paid off the diner, he did actually get an entryway for it. His aerial version looking down on the diner when it did not have the entry. There's a menu from that diner. By 1957, the diner did get an entryway from Fodero. And then here it is in 1973, when Hall & Oates visited. Daryl Hall's grandmother lived right across the street from where the diner was moved after it was removed from the site in 1965 over to here. The owner had owned this property and some property across the street. So the diner was fairly intact at this point. And I found it in February 28, 1982. Luckily, it was the middle of the winter, so all that undergrowth and stuff that had appeared since 1973 did not have any leaves on it, which made for me to take this picture. You know, I was able to do it in this one here. So about 15 months later, I went back and it was completely stripped. Did not look anything like when I found it in '82. So. And here's the story of Lamy's Diner. This was a Worcester launch car that was originally in Marlborough, Massachusetts. This is its original location, courtesy of the Marlborough Historical Society. See Lamy's Diner over here to the left, and 3 doors down, you see Sharon's Diner, also known as Skook's Diner. The Skook's Diner actually lasted into the 1970s. I actually ate in that diner in 1972, I believe. And I remember going inside saying, boy, this is like the smallest diner I've ever been in. Anyways, so there's Lamy's. Here's a colorized sort of version of Lamy's at that location. And here's an interior shot after the diner was delivered and was operating. All the pies and pie case and the people having coffee, somebody sweeping the floor. That's Mr. Clovis Lamy behind the counter. And eventually the diner moved from Marlborough to Framingham briefly, and then it was sold and it went to Hudson, Massachusetts to become the Hudson Diner. This is one of my photographs from May 1981. By February 1984, the diner was closed, taken for back taxes it was owed by the state. And this is where the Henry Ford Museum came in. Richard Gutman, who had consulted with the Henry Ford Museum, became the consultant for the lunch wagon that they had. And they were looking for a diner, and he clued them into this one, and they bought the diner. And here it is, March 1984. The diner is being prepped to move out. I got there early and was able to secure a location across the street on top of a boulder at the corner of an empty lot, so I could get ahead above everybody else. And I took all these pictures of the diner being picked up and moved to the trailer. And there's Mr. Clovis Lamy back in 1984 when the diner was being moved to the museum. They needed, the Henry Ford Museum needed parts to restore the diner to the way it looked originally because it had been modified over the years. And I clued Richard Gutman into this diner up in Loudon, New Hampshire was possibly available, and he was able to get in touch with the owners. And the Henry Ford Museum negotiated a salvage price for removing parts from this diner. And that's it in 1985 with the booths and everything that they were taking removed from the diner. And here it is, November 7, 1987, fully restored inside the Henry Ford Museum, looking exactly the way it did when it was installed in Marlborough. And that's it for the show.
Okay, Larry, that was absolutely fantastic. Can you hear me all right, Larry?
I sure can.
Okay, that was amazing. Talk about an encyclopedic knowledge of diners. It's remarkable. And it was organized just the way that I liked it too, because I was hoping that you would talk about the various different manufacturers. Now, we've had a lot of questions here. And so I'm going to actually ask some of the people that asked the questions to ask them themselves. Eric, are you still on the line, Eric? Can you unmute yourself? Eric Mearns asked, are there any contemporary manufacturers of prefabricated diners? And I think you did mention that, but perhaps you could just repeat that.
Yeah, definitely. The Raffaele in New Rochelle, New York is still building diners. And I think they're into the third or fourth generation of family that's running that company. Coleman unfortunately went out of business within the last 15 to 20 years. Paramount might still be around, but he's probably Herb Enyart, who was the last person running that company, might be fairly retired by this time. So Starlight Diners might still be making them. I'm not sure at this point, but certainly DeRafley is the only old line manufacturer still actually building.
Okay, that's interesting. Eric, are you there? Did you want to follow up at all? If so, just unmute yourself. No, maybe Eric's gone. Okay, Jean Mercer Ballard had an interesting question. She says, did the Mediterranean style come in with in the 1970s with the ethnicity of ownership? You know, a lot of Greek people own restaurants, and you think that had an effect on these styles?
That is probably a reasonable assumption, because yes, Greek American ownership of diners goes back decades. Yeah, I would say because the diner manufacturers were very tuned in to the different customer base that they had. Also, you know, some of that was dictated by the fact that some towns and cities said, we don't want stainless steel diners. And that sort of precipitated the change of styling, for sure, with the brick look and the colonial look, that type of thing. So,
okay. Now, Jean, if you're there, would you please unmute yourself, because you had a very interesting comment too. Are you there, Jean?
I am. This is
Okay.
Jeannie.
Okay, so could you repeat that comment you made later on about how you worked in a design firm, and that was fascinating.
Yeah, I actually graduated undergrad in interior design. I actually teach interior design and lighting design now and teach hospitality design. But after graduation, within months, I got my dream job, and that was designing restaurants in Chicago. Let Us Entertain You was one of our largest clients, and they had already been doing some Ed DeBevics for a few years because those started in the late 80s. But when I came on board, we were doing them in several other cities, but also primarily the ones I worked on were mainly in Japan. And that was just fun because we got to use all of the retro style elements from the mid-century diners, and just such great materials and graphics and furniture and signing, you know, down to signage and decor items. In fact, I had to go search at antique stores for little tchotchkes that would be on the shelves. And I found it humorous to find some great, you know, items from like the 50s and be sending pieces to Japan that on the bottom said made in occupied Japan. So that felt a little weird to be doing that, but they were from the right era and they had the right look for it. But then we also had the brewer, Spot and Franziskaner was one of our clients at one point doing American diners in Germany. So was always influenced by these books that were coming out at the time and all the great, you know, history that you've captured, these photographs, and, you know, just experiencing it myself. But the photographs and all the history that was captured was so helpful to kind of bringing that together. So thank you to all of you that have documented it over the years.
That's great, Jean. Thank you. And I love the last line of your comment. And by the way, all of these comments and questions will be forwarded to Larry as well. But he says, you say, I've always loved diners and love this presentation. I can smell these diners. That's great. Now, Susan Bregman, let's go back a little bit. Frank Ruska asked an interesting question. He says, so many diners use the same Gothic lettering on their fronts. Was this a sign of a specific manufacturer, or was it a design convention used by many diner operators?
Well, that's an interesting question. I know Worcester Lunch Car early on did not use that old English type lettering. They did starting in probably the late 20s, early 30s. They started doing that more often. Worcester actually was the the one that used the porcelain enameled steel panels with the graphics, the longest of any of the manufacturers, which sort of put them behind the curve by the 50s. They didn't start using a lot more stainless steel till the end of the 40s into the early 50s, but they were being outclassed by all the mid-Atlantic diner manufacturers. But Worcester definitely used it. Other people might have as well, but don't forget some of the early diners were just painted galvanized steel panels. So I know a lot of the earlier Worcester lunch wagons had hand painted, and they did different letter forms back then as well. But the Old English seemed to survive the most on the Worcester lunch cars.
Thank you. Frank, I don't know if you're still online. Did you have a follow-up or anything? If so, just unmute yourself. If not, we'll carry on. We'll go to Susan. And that's actually a good segue from your last answer, Larry, where it says, Susan Brigman asked, what was the last Worcester lunch car built, and is it still around?
Well, yeah, I did show it. It was originally Lloyd's Diner in Johnston, Rhode Island. That's Worcester lunch car number 850. That was moved in the early 90s out of, actually late 80s, out of Johnston, Rhode Island. It actually came up to Weymouth, Massachusetts for 2 or 3 or 4 years, not too long. It was the front of a dance club called Shaboom's in Weymouth, South Weymouth, Massachusetts. And I have pictures of it there. And then actually Shaboom's sort of changed, and whatever went into the building behind, they sort of disguised the diner, but it didn't hurt it any, because when that went belly up, the diner ended up getting sold. In fact, that diner almost went to England, but then that didn't happen, and it got sold to Alexis Stewart, Martha Stewart's daughter, and she moved it to Bridgehampton, Long Island, hoping to set it up as something called the Delish Diner. Well, the town fathers in Bridgehampton decided, nope, we don't want this. So it sat in the field for two years or so. I found it down there in 1992 in the field and took pictures of it. And then within, I don't know, 3 years or so, it was moved to New Hampshire, where it is today, up in New Hampton, New Hampshire on Route 104, now known as the Route 104 Diner. But when it was first brought up there, it was called Bobby's Girl. And ironically, I knew the people who brought it there. They had a previous diner moved to New Hampshire from upstate New York, and they ran that for a few years before they got out of it. And then they missed the diner, so they bought this one and moved that to New Hampton and set it up. And when they got it, I went and talked to them. My sister and brother-in-law lived right almost within walking distance of where the diner was moved to. And I talked to them, and they said, oh, we're missing 2 stools out of this diner. And I said, oh, wow. Yeah, last time I saw it, it had the stools in it. So they said that somebody had told them that these weren't the original stools. And I said, oh, yes, they were. And they said, why do you say that? I said, because I have 2 stools from that was Worcester lunch car number 850. I had 2 stools from Worcester lunch car 849, and they were the exact same stools, and they were just sitting in my mother's basement. So they asked me if I'd sell them to them. I said, sure, I'm not doing anything with them. So I gave them a bargain, $25 a piece, and I hand delivered it to them, and they put it in the diner, and it's still there today. So, I mean, there was no way they were going to match them otherwise. And I just happened to have 2 stools that did the trick. So
That's a great story.
yeah.
Frances Perianis, I hope I'm saying that correctly, has an interesting question. She says, are you documenting the evolution from lunch carts to the current food trucks?
Well, actually, food trucks are basically the new version of the lunch wagon. That's all it is. I mean, even the catering trucks that used to come around to different factory sites and stuff with, they flip the doors open and they, you walk up to the truck and you pick out what you want. That's basically, they're all descendants of the lunch wagon. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Peter, I just saw your face flash up on the screen for a minute. Do you want to tell Larry about the Valentine Diner?
Yeah, that's there was 2 or 3 of them in Albuquerque for some strange reason, but I think I don't know, was that one that was made in like Wichita, Kansas or somewhere? I can't remember exactly where they came from.
That's exactly right. Valentine.
But they were pretty small.
Yep.
And there was one called the TikTok Diner, in the northern part of Albuquerque, and a young couple bought it, ran it for several years, and they moved it up to some ski town in Colorado. But there was another one in town that was downtown, on the west side of downtown. It was still operating as a diner when I was a college student, like 50 years ago. But eventually the preservationists said, we got to save this thing. They're kind of, you don't see them too much in the West. So the city bought it, and it's used as a police substation near the university, right near the corner of the southeast corner of the university. And quite small, but they have it's always staffed. There's a car or 2 out there. So I can send a picture of it to you if you'd like.
Yeah, I did know about that one, of course. Followed them over the years. Unfortunately, I only photographed that one in New York State that ceased being a diner probably within a year or 2 of when I visited it. But actually, Southwest is a stronghold of the Valentine diners. There were a lot of them spread out over the area, and they were from Wichita, Kansas.
I'd love to find a book on them. That's since they're such a curiosity.
Well, the Kansas State Historical website has a huge page more of about the history of Valentine diners.
Oh, cool. I'll have to take a look at that. Thank you.
Yep.
Now, if you watched the last month's presentation by Frank Briska, he asks another question here. His presentation, of course, was on Jack Kerouac's On the Road. And he says in Jack Kerouac's On the Road, he appears to use the label lunch cart when I think he was referring to diners in general. Was lunch cart a regional term used for diners?
Well, lunch cart, okay, was the original mobile diner, okay. And up here in New England where lunch cart started, that term was used, in varying degrees, either diner or lunch wagon, or lunch cart, and being that Kerouac was from Lowell was a big diner town. I mean, it was a mill town. And even when I started photographing diners in the early 1980s, all the old mill towns still seemed to have the highest concentration of diners at that point. So, and Lowell had 5 or 6 of them, if not more.
Okay. Jillian Mulder asks, I'm interested in Clausen lunch carts out of Glen Falls, New York. Are there any good photographs of those anywhere, or do they still exist?
There's no, to my knowledge, there's no Clausens left. There were a bunches of them around, and I have some photos in my collection from other people. In fact, Gilly's Lunch Wagon up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the diner that preceded that was a Clausen, which was interesting. And when Gilly's acquired the Worcester lunch car, that actually had operated in Fall River, Massachusetts, before it ended up in Portsmouth to replace the Clausen. So, but there were pictures. I think Mike Engel from I don't know if he's a member of the SCA or not. He does a New York Capital District Diners or New York Diners web page. I believe. I haven't been on it in a while, so I can't say for sure. But he knew a little bit about the Clausen company.
Okay, I believe he is a member of the SCA, actually.
Mm.
Jean Mercer-Ballard asks another question, and this is a very important one. Will you archive your work and photos somewhere in the future? And if so, where for
Yeah.
future researchers?
Well, that's a good question now. I've actually scanned all my slides. I have, God, 5 boxes of slides that each hold around 1,200 slides apiece, but they've all been scanned. And then I also have images of 35 millimeter prints that I took prior to the slides. So there's thousands of images. At some point, I want to donate the slides and maybe the prints to someplace, but I have no idea where at this point. Richard Gutman donated his complete diner collection, or pretty much the whole thing, to the Henry Ford Museum. And I was hoping to donate mine to the Culinary Arts Museum at Johnson and Wales, but they don't really exist per se anymore. So I actually have to change my will. I put them in there years ago. So I have no idea where my stuff is going, but I'm trying to prepare that. And that's why I've got these archive boxes of slides right now that I've in the last few months put together. So I know where everything is.
Well, you know what? I mean, I'll just make 2 quick comments on that. First of all, our Zoom presentation in August is by Irene Lule, the secretary of the SCA, and her presentation is on exactly that, what to do with your collections and so on, where can they go? She's an archivist. And then the other thing is on the board of the SCA, we've recently been discussing this exact thing. What about people who have these amazing collections? Unless there's some more suitable place to put them, would the SCA be willing to take them, just like we took in Jim Seeland's motel database, and that's now available on the website and so on. And I don't want to prejudge what will come out of that discussion, but I think the members of the board anyway are leaning towards that the SCA needs to become a depository for this kind of very important work. And of course, it's right in the, right in the middle of our mandate. So stay tuned for something new on that. Now, Frank asks again, the red arrow in Manchester, New Hampshire claims it was not manufactured, but rather constructed on site, assuming that what they're telling me is correct. He says, it looks like an old archtop diner. Were many diners built on site to resemble the factory manufactured structures?
Well, the red arrow definitely is on site, but certainly the interior reminds you of a barrel roof diner, but it's not exactly rounded per se. But and the setup is definitely a diner setup on the inside. It may have actually started out as a lunch wagon, then they just built it bigger. I have photos of a lunch wagon that my mother's cousins ran out in Marlborough, Massachusetts, where Lamy's was originally. This was it was funny. My mother always told me about this diner, her cousin's diner, and she showed me a photo that she dug out of her dresser back in early 1982, and I recognized the building. And I said, oh, this isn't a diner. But then I looked really closely at it. The photo was from 1930. And the front wall of this building was the remains of a lunch wagon. And that had been expanded into a regular little peaked roof building. And up until that point, the building was still there and operating as D'Antonio's Diner. When my mother's cousins had it, it was Tony's Cafe. And so I said, I'm going to take a ride out there. I went out there and I found it had just been torn down. So I missed it by months, if not, weeks.
Wow.
But I actually have 2 postcards showing the lunch wagon prior to it being built into a bigger building. So.
Wow, that's a shame you missed it.
So the red arrow is probably on that. The red arrow diners now are this is a small chain in New Hampshire, but they're not using any real diners. They're using on-site buildings. Although they did have the Milford Diner in Milford, New Hampshire, briefly for a few years. But I guess that chain started out in the 20s. the 1920s and expanded to on-site restaurants as well as diners, because I have pictures of a diner that was called the Red Arrow in Nashua, New Hampshire. And it was a brill diner similar to the Capitol Diner in Lynn. So, yeah.
Okay. Nancy Sturm, our illustrious past president, who grew up in the South, asked the question, were diners more of a Northern and Midwestern thing? I don't recall too many in the South.
Yeah, all the diner manufacturers, historically were in the Northeast, few in New England, but more in the mid-Atlantic states, New Jersey, New York, and so on. And as diners kept on getting larger, they didn't travel a lot farther from the company. Even in Massachusetts, in northern New England, we didn't get any new diners after the 1960s, really, or hardly any. So because it was getting prohibitively costly to build multi-section diners and move them so far. The South did get a few over the years. A bunch of some diners ended up down in Florida by Jerry O'Mahony. There's been various places that had lunch wagons or diners in the South, but they weren't predominant. And the further west you went, you didn't see much on the other side of the Mississippi River. They just didn't make it that far. Some did, not too often.
Yeah, and I can also say that I'm in, as you probably know, in Toronto, Canada, and I don't know of any diners in Canada. I think there might have been one or two in Quebec. I've never seen one in Ontario, which is strange because it's really very similar to the northeastern United States. But do you know of any that made it up to Canada, Larry?
Yeah, there were two of them that made it up to Montreal in the 1990s. One of them might still be operating, but it might not be as a diner. It was called the La Galaxy Diner.
Okay.
And that was a diner that used to be here in Massachusetts called Uncle Will's on Route 20 in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. It was shipped up to Canada as a derelict, if you want to call it that. That way they didn't have to pay a lot of taxes to bring it over the border. And it actually got stripped down to the frame and rebuilt, which is amazing. That was one of the first frame off diners I saw in recent years that they actually did that too. So
wow. Okay. Julie sent a helpful link to a organization that will take collections of architecture and design publications. So you can look at that. And by the way, I'm passing over all the many compliments you're getting here, Larry, from our viewers, because you'll get these comments, and so you can read them yourself. Jean says she's in Boone, North Carolina. They have one diner. It's got the best breakfasts and hash browns and biscuits, and it's called Troy's 105 Diner. Do you know that one?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, well, maybe that'll be something if you take a trip down south.
Yeah, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Okay. Oh, that's all the questions. No, I have a question. And I found it very interesting. In one of the very earliest pictures that you showed of the original lunch carts or lunch wagons, there seemed to be on the windows, it wasn't very clear, but I thought I saw like pictures of women in sort of burlesque type costumes. I'm not sure if I was imagining that. So also, just to finish off the question, a lot of the early ones say separate seating for ladies or ladies welcome. So was this kind of a very male-oriented culture at the beginning?
Oh, yes, definitely. Lunch wagons were primarily men. Women didn't want to come in and sit on a stool. But the other thing, that the flash glass that you're talking about in the windows, those were mostly like goddesses or something. They did varying things. It was flash glass that they used. Usually it was clear glass fused with colored glass to create that look. And as time went on and diner operators wanted to cater to female clientele as well as males, they put on the panels, it might say tables for ladies or booth service as was more commonly. But that was a way to do it, to bring in the female clientele. So,
I see. Okay, well, that makes sense. Okay, Larry, well, that's the end of the questions. There's lots of comments here too, which you can read when you have a chance, and there's a few suggestions about where to find some more information too. But I just like to take this opportunity again to thank you for an amazing presentation. The saddest part of that was the abandoned ones. It's heartbreaking to look at those and say, hey, that's a place where people, went to get together and chat, and now they're sitting derelict in a farmer's field somewhere. But that's all part of it, I guess. I'd like to remind everybody as well about next month's presentation. Actually, this month, in 2 weeks' time, Erica Nelson and the world's largest collection of the world's smallest versions of the world's largest things. And that's on Wednesday, June 15th at 8 o'clock, not at 7. We altered the time for Larry. Also, remember that the presentation and all the questions and answers have been recorded. They will be on the SCA's website within a day or two. So if you miss something or you want to refer somebody to it, don't hesitate to go there. And with that, Larry and everyone watching, I'll wish you a good night and I hope to see you in 2 weeks.
All right, and here's a Southern diner.
Oh, okay.
Pig, Kentucky.
Pig out, pig out, pig out. And Pig Kentucky. Oh my
So
goodness.
maybe Ms. Sturm can head up that way. Have a nice Southern diner.
Yeah, well, that's a good one, Peter. And I'm sure there's lots of them. Anyways, good night all. And we'll hope to see you again in 2 weeks.
All right, take care.
thank you.